On my 75th birthday, I called my son and asked if he wanted to grab dinner. He sighed heavily into the phone and told me he was drowning in a crisis at the firm and could not possibly make it. I decided a woman of my age should not eat alone on her birthday, so I went by myself to the most exclusive restaurant in the city. But when the hostess led me toward my table, I stopped dead in my tracks. There at the center booth was my son. He was not working. I was raising an $800 bottle of champagne with his wife and her mother already dining and laughing. And right as I prepared to walk over and demand an explanation, my phone buzzed with a text from my grandson. It said, "Grandma, do not go home. Dad just forged your signature and executed a blind trust transfer. He stole $2.5 million. What I did next stunned the entire restaurant and sent my son out the door in handcuffs. I am Gloria Vance, 75 years old, and this is the story of how my own flesh and blood tried to bury me alive and how my grandson helped me dig the grave they would eventually fall into." The lies started exactly at 4 o'clock that afternoon. I was standing in my walk-in closet, fastening the clasp on my pearl earrings, looking at my reflection in the mirror. 75. I had earned every silver hair on my head, every line around my eyes. I picked up my phone and dialed my son Marcus. I was 48 years old, the chief operating officer of my logistics and commercial real estate company. I had groomed him for that position since he was in high school. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his voice dripping with manufactured exhaustion. "Mom," he said, letting out a long, ragged breath. "I am so sorry. I am absolutely swamped at the firm right now. The quarterly audits are a nightmare, and the compliance team just dumped 10 boxes of files on my desk. I cannot make dinner tonight. I will make it up to you next week, I promise. Happy birthday, though." I stood there in the quiet of my closet, adjusting my emerald green dress. I felt a familiar twinge of disappointment, but I pushed it down. Marcus had been distant lately, always making excuses, always too busy. I told him it was fine, told him to work hard, and hung up. I did not yell, I did not complain. Because 40 years ago, when his father passed away and left me with nothing but a toddler and a mountain of medical debt, I did not complain either. I scrubbed industrial kitchen floors in the mornings and waitressed at night. In the 1980s, nobody in Atlanta wanted to give a commercial loan to a young widowed black woman with no collateral. They laughed me out of banking offices. They told me to aim lower. But I scraped together every dime, bought a dilapidated warehouse in the West End, fixed it with my own bare hands, and turned it into the foundation of Vance Logistics. I built a commercial empire worth tens of millions of dollars out of dirt and sweat, so Marcus could go to Yale, so he could wear $3,000 suits, so he could have a life I never had. If my chief operating officer said he had to work, I chose to respect his work ethic. I refused to sit in my empty house and feel sorry for myself. I grabbed my leather clutch, walked out to my garage, and got into my vintage Cadillac. I drove myself to the Onyx, the absolute pinnacle of fine dining in Atlanta. The valet opened my door with a respectful nod, and the hostess smiled warmly the moment I walked through the glass doors. She asked if I was joining a party, and I told her I was dining alone for my birthday. She immediately grabbed a menu and led me through the dimly lit, elegant dining room, navigating the maze of wealthy patrons and jazz music. We were halfway across the room when my feet simply stopped moving. I stepped back, pressing my shoulder against a thick, cold marble pillar, completely hidden from view. My heart gave a strange, painful flutter against my ribs. Sitting right there at the most expensive center booth in the restaurant was Marcus. He was not looking at audit files. He was not trapped in a compliance meeting. He was throwing his head back in roaring laughter. Sitting next to him was his wife, Chloe. She was wearing a new diamond necklace that caught the dim restaurant lighting, her smile wide and predatory. And sitting across from them was Chloe's mother, Vivian. Vivian was a woman who had not worked a single day since the late 90s. She was a professional socialite, a woman who lived off alimony and credit cards, someone I had always kept at arm's length. I stood frozen behind the pillar, listening to the clinking of their glasses. I could see the label on the bottle the waiter was pouring for them. It was a crystal vintage that ran about $800 a bottle. The jazz band was playing something smooth and slow, but I could hear their voices perfectly over the music. To the smartest son-in-law in Atlanta, Vivian beamed, raising her crystal flute high into the air. "I still cannot believe you managed to close on that Savannah area beachfront property today. Cash no less. You are an absolute miracle worker. Marcus, I cannot wait to start decorating the master suite." My stomach dropped. Savannah area beachfront property. Marcus and Chloe lived well, but they did not have Savannah cash. They certainly did not have the capital to buy an oceanfront property outright for Vivian. Chloe giggled, leaning into Marcus and swirling her champagne. "Well," she sneered, her voice laced with venom, "it is about time we actually enjoyed some of that wealth. His mother sits on all those commercial properties like a dragon guarding gold. I swear that expired relic is going to outlive us all just out of spite. She treats Marcus like an employee instead of the rightful heir. It is exhausting. Expired relic." I squeezed the handle of my clutch so hard my knuckles ached. This woman, who lived in a luxury Buckhead mansion that my company paid the mortgage on, was calling me an expired relic. This woman who spent her days at the country club while I was still reviewing commercial leases at 7 in the morning was waiting for me to die. Marcus did not defend me. He did not tell his wife to watch her mouth. Instead, he smiled. It was a nervous, tight, calculating smile. "Just keep your voices down," Marcus muttered, leaning across the table. "Let us just keep this quiet until the deed is fully recorded tomorrow morning. Mom does not need to know anything about my sudden restructuring. Her memory is slipping anyway. She thought she paid the commercial landscapers twice last month. She is losing her grip. She will not even notice the liquidity shift until it is way too late." My blood turned to absolute ice. My memory was not slipping. I caught our commercial landscaper overcharging us and fired him on the spot. Marcus was intentionally building a false narrative. He was planting seeds telling his wife and mother-in-law that my mind was failing. I stepped out from behind the pillar. I was ready to walk over to that table, flip that $800 bottle of champagne onto his lap, and demand to know exactly what liquidity shift he was talking about. I was ready to drag my 48-year-old son out of that restaurant by his expensive silk tie. But right before I could take that first step, my phone vibrated violently inside my clutch. I stopped. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from my 20-year-old grandson, Jamal. Jamal was Marcus's son from his first marriage. He was a brilliant college junior majoring in cybersecurity and forensic accounting. I had given Jamal an internship at my company last year to teach him the family business. The preview of the text message made my breath catch in my throat. I opened it, my eyes scanning the words in the dim light of the restaurant. "Grandma, do not go home. Call me right now. Dad just triggered a massive wire transfer from your primary commercial holding account. He bypassed the bank's standard security. He stole $2.5 million. He set up a blind trust to hide the routing numbers, and he forged your signature on a medical power of attorney claiming you are legally incapacitated. Do not go to your house. He changed the access codes." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The jazz music faded away. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of wealthy conversation vanished. There was only the text message. The number was enormous, but the money was no longer the part that frightened me most. The forged claim that I was legally incapacitated could take away my voice before I had the chance to challenge the theft. The dominoes crashed down in my mind with terrifying speed. The refusal to have dinner with me was not a coincidence. It was a strategic distraction. He wanted me sitting alone in my house waiting for him, totally isolated while he finalized the theft of my life's work. He bought Vivian a beachfront property with my retirement funds. I was trying to legally erase my mind, to strip me of my rights, to declare me an incompetent old woman so he could bleed my accounts dry without me having any legal recourse to stop him. And he was doing it right now, celebrating with an $800 bottle of champagne 20 feet away from the mother whose back he was stepping on. They thought because I was 75 I was weak. They thought because I loved my son I was blind. They thought the old lady would just quietly fade away and let them take the empire she built. They forgot that I survived the streets of Atlanta. They forgot that I fought ruthless corporate sharks for 40 years and buried every single one of them. I slipped my phone back into my clutch. I did not cry. I did not call the police in a panic. I stood up completely straight, squared my shoulders, and prepared to show my son exactly what an expired relic could do. I did not shed a single tear. Tears are a luxury for women who have a safety net, and I had just discovered that mine was woven from razor wire. I stood behind that cold marble pillar and watched a young waiter approach their table carrying a silver ice bucket. Inside that bucket rested a second bottle of vintage champagne, $800 of fermented grapes paid for by the sweat of a woman they thought they were erasing from existence. I stepped out from the shadows just as the waiter passed my pillar. I reached out and gently placed my hand on his forearm. He stopped, startled by my sudden appearance. I kept my voice barely above a whisper, smooth and commanding. I told him to hand me the leather checkbook tucked under his arm. He hesitated, looking toward my son's table, but something in my posture made him comply without a word. I opened the black folder. The bill was already sitting at over $1,200. I reached into my clutch, pulled out my heavy metal credit card, and slid it into the leather flap. I looked the waiter directly in the eye and told him to run the card, close the tab, and bring me the customer receipt immediately. I stood there in the dim light of the restaurant while he hurried to the nearest terminal. My mind was operating with the cold, unforgiving precision of a financial ledger. Marcus had built his plan around one assumption: that he could control what other people believed about my competence before I could put evidence in front of them. That assumption was about to meet the woman who had spent 40 years surviving hostile negotiations. The waiter returned, handing me the receipt in a heavy silver pen. I signed my name with deliberate, perfect cursive. It was the exact same signature my son had just tried to forge on federal banking documents. I took the receipt, folded it neatly between my fingers, and walked straight toward the center booth. My heels clicked against the polished hardwood floor, cutting through the low hum of wealthy patrons and the soft notes of the jazz band. Marcus had his back to me. He was leaning across the table, whispering something to Vivian, his hands animating a story I would never care to hear. Chloe was the first to see me. Her perfectly manicured hand froze halfway to her mouth. The crystal glass trembled against her lips, spilling a drop of champagne onto her silk dress. Her eyes widened, her false lashes fluttering in sudden, unadulterated panic. She tapped her husband on the arm hard. Marcus turned his head, visibly annoyed by the interruption, until his gaze landed on my emerald green dress. The color drained from his face so fast it looked as though someone had pulled a plug in his neck. He went from a flushed, triumphant shade of pink to a sickly, translucent gray in less than a second. His elbow jerked back, knocking over his water glass. The ice cascaded across the white linen tablecloth, soaking into the fabric, dripping onto his expensive suit pants. He jumped up, stammering, his hands hovering in the air as if trying to push away an apparition. "Mom." Marcus choked on the word. He looked around wildly, checking the surrounding tables, terrified that someone from his corporate firm might be watching. "What are you doing here? I thought you were at home resting." "I thought we were celebrating next week." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I stepped up to the edge of the booth, looking down at the three of them. I answered that I had changed my plans, rather than spend the evening waiting for a dinner that was never going to happen. I asked him if it was not a miraculous coincidence that I chose the exact same restaurant where my chief operating officer was allegedly drowning in a massive firm crisis. Vivian clutched her pearl necklace, her mouth opening and closing in shock, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. Chloe, however, recovered faster. She had always been a master of manipulation. She stood up, smoothing down her designer dress, and put on a mask of deep, condescending concern. She reached out, trying to place a comforting hand on my shoulder. I stepped back before she could touch me, my eyes locked onto hers. "Gloria, please calm down." Chloe kept her voice low and soothing, deliberately adopting the tone one might use with a frightened, confused child. "You are clearly disoriented. We told you we had a critical business dinner tonight with potential logistics investors. You must have gotten the days mixed up again. This has been happening a lot lately, hasn't it? Marcus, honey, you said she missed her medication this morning. We really need to get you back home where you can rest. You are having an episode." She looked around at the neighboring tables, offering the onlookers an apologetic, weary smile. She was flawlessly playing the role of the burdened, loving daughter-in-law, dealing with a tragic mental decline. It was a performance worthy of an award designed to strip me of my credibility before I could utter a single accusation. I looked at her outstretched hand, then up to her perfectly contoured face. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the folded receipt. I dropped it directly onto Vivian's plate, right on top of her half-eaten filet mignon. I told Chloe my memory was functioning flawlessly. I told her I remembered exactly what day it was, exactly who I was, and exactly whose money she was spending. I pointed at the receipt. I told them I just paid their $1,200 dinner bill. I suggested they consider it a housewarming gift for the Savannah area beachfront property they closed on 3 hours ago. The silence at the table was absolute. The background music seemed to vanish entirely from my awareness. Vivian stared at the receipt on her plate, her eyes darting frantically toward Marcus. Marcus slumped back into the leather booth, his chest heaving the air completely knocked out of his lungs. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet him. Chloe tried to speak again, tried to mount another defense about my supposed confusion, but I cut her off completely. I leaned over the table, planting my palms flat against the mahogany wood, invading their space and forcing them to look at me. I kept my voice low, dropping each word like a heavy stone. I asked Marcus whether he truly expected me to accept a medical directive bearing my name when I had never met the physician who supposedly evaluated me. I asked whether he had even considered what would happen when the signature timestamp and filing trail were compared side by side. I told him he had profoundly underestimated the woman who raised him. I reminded them all exactly who I was. I told Chloe that 40 years ago, while her mother Vivienne was bankrupting her third husband and losing her house to federal tax collectors, I was on my hands and knees scrubbing industrial floors in the West End. I told them about the banks that redlined my loan applications, the predatory lenders who tried to steal my first warehouse, and the sleep I lost building Vance Logistics from a single delivery truck into a multi-million-dollar commercial empire. I looked Vivienne dead in the eye and told her that every diamond on her daughter's neck, every drop of champagne in her glass, and every brick of that Savannah area beach house was paid for by my calluses and my sacrifices. I told Marcus he was a coward who wore the suits my money bought, pretending to be a self-made man, when in reality he was just a desperate thief hiding behind a forged notary stamp and a fake medical evaluation. Marcus was shaking now. The sophisticated, untouchable executive was completely unspooling in front of my eyes. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a group of corporate attorneys from a rival firm watching our table with intense, undisguised interest. The public humiliation was burning him alive. His survival instinct kicked in, fueled by sheer panic and an absolute desperation to control the narrative before his career evaporated. He stood up abruptly, pointing a trembling finger at me. He raised his voice, making sure the entire dining room could hear him. He announced that I was completely unstable, that I was suffering from severe paranoia, and that I had escaped from my daytime caregiver. He turned toward the front desk and snapped his fingers aggressively in the air, shouting for the manager. He demanded that security remove this sick, delusional woman from the premises immediately before she hurt somebody or damaged property. He played the victim perfectly, broadcasting his fabricated grief to the room. A hush fell over the entire restaurant. Waiters stopped in their tracks, balancing heavy trays of food. The jazz band completely ceased playing the saxophonist, lowering his instrument. A tall, distinguished man in a tailored suit emerged from the back office and walked swiftly across the dining room floor. It was David, the general manager of the restaurant. Marcus stepped out of the booth to meet him. Looking visibly relieved that authority had arrived to handle his problem, Marcus puffed out his chest and spoke with aggressive, arrogant entitlement. He told David that he was a senior executive and a highly valued patron, and he demanded that I be forcibly escorted out the back door immediately to avoid any further disruption to the wealthy guests. He said it was a tragic family medical situation, that I was a danger to myself, and that I was completely out of my mind. David did not look at Marcus. He did not signal for the security guards lingering near the entrance. He walked right past my sweating, hyperventilating son and stopped directly in front of me. David gave a slight, respectful bow of his head. He ignored Marcus entirely. He asked me very politely if everything was to my satisfaction this evening and if I needed him to contact my personal driver to bring my car around to the private entrance. Marcus stood there completely baffled. His mouth hung open. He demanded to know why the manager was speaking to a delusional intruder instead of removing her. David finally turned his head to look at my son. His expression was cold and completely professional. He informed Marcus that he could not remove me from the premises. He explained in a voice clear enough for the rival attorneys 2 tables away to hear that I was not just a guest. He explained that Vance Logistics owned the entire commercial plaza. He told Marcus that I held the commercial lease for the restaurant, the parking garage, and the retail spaces on the entire block. I was the landlord. David looked Marcus up and down and stated that if I wanted a table removed, a patron escorted out, or the entire restaurant shut down for the night, he would do it instantly. The sheer magnitude of Marcus's miscalculation settled over the table like a suffocating blanket. He had tried to flex his corporate power and label me a trespassing lunatic in a building where his mother literally owned the ground beneath his feet. I turned my back on my son and walked toward the elevated stage in the corner of the sprawling dining room. My emerald green heels struck the polished mahogany floorboards with heavy rhythmic thuds. The jazz quartet was midway through a soft saxophone solo, the notes drifting lazily through the humid air of the restaurant. I did not ask for permission. I stepped onto the platform, reached right past the stunned saxophonist, and wrapped my hand around the cold chrome stem of the microphone. I pulled it free from the stand. The sudden feedback whined through the massive restaurant speakers, a sharp, piercing sound that brought every single conversation in the room to a dead halt. 150 heads turned toward me in absolute silence. Wealthy socialites lowered their silver forks. Corporate executives set down their crystal bourbon glasses. I scanned the room, finding the exact faces I needed. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and deeply resonant. "I apologize for interrupting your incredibly expensive dinners. My name is Gloria Vance, the founder and chief executive officer of Vance Logistics. Today is my 75th birthday." A few people near the front tables began to clap politely, assuming this was a celebratory announcement. I raised my free hand and sliced it through the air to silence them immediately. "Do not clap for me," I commanded. "Reserve your applause for my son, Marcus Vance, the senior wealth manager sitting right there at the center booth." I pointed directly at him. Every head in the restaurant pivoted toward the booth. Marcus was sweating profusely, the moisture glistening on his forehead under the dim chandelier light. He gripped the edge of his table, looking like a cornered animal. My son told me just 2 hours ago that he was drowning in quarterly compliance audits. I continued enunciating every syllable with precision. Yet here he sits, celebrating a beachfront purchase, while a transfer bearing my forged authority is moving through accounts I never approved. The contradiction was enough to make several people at nearby tables stop pretending not to listen. A collective horrifying gasp sucked the oxygen right out of the building. Silverware clattered loudly against porcelain plates as people dropped their utensils in sheer shock. I scanned the room and locked eyes with Richard Hayes, the managing partner at the financial advisory firm that handled part of Vance Logistics' investment portfolio, who was dining 2 tables away with his wife. Richard slowly lowered his linen napkin onto his lap. His face turned a dangerous, furious shade of crimson. He stared at Marcus with unadulterated professional disgust. Marcus leaped from the leather booth, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward. It crashed violently into a passing waiter, sending a silver tray of empty water glasses shattering into 100 pieces across the floor. "Mom, stop this insanity right now," Marcus shouted. His voice cracked with intense, uncontrollable panic. He waved his hands frantically toward the surrounding tables. "She is having a severe medical episode," he yelled to his colleagues. "Do not listen to a single word she is saying. She has severe dementia. She does not know what she is talking about." I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, gripping the microphone tighter. I told the room there was a Nevada entity in the routing chain and that the authorization packet carried a signature I had never given. I did not try to litigate the entire case from a restaurant stage. I gave Richard Hayes one practical instruction: preserve every record his firm held involving Marcus before anyone had time to alter a file. Richard's expression told me he understood exactly why preservation mattered. Chloe buried her face deep in her hands, sliding down low in the leather booth to hide from the burning stares of her high society friends. Vivian looked genuinely physically ill, clutching her stomach as the reality of her lost Savannah area mansion set in. I prepared to deliver the final crushing blow. I wanted to announce to the entire room that the wire transfer had been frozen by my grandson and that Marcus was completely bankrupt. But before I could speak another word, a sudden, blinding flash of red and blue lights washed across the frosted glass of the restaurant's front windows. Heavy, authoritative boots pounded against the entrance tiles. The thick oak double doors of the restaurant swung open with tremendous force. 4 Atlanta police officers marched into the dining room, their hands resting cautiously on their dark utility belts. They were followed closely by 2 city paramedics, pushing a heavy, collapsible metal gurney. I lowered the microphone, feeling a massive surge of triumphant satisfaction hitting my chest. I automatically assumed the bank manager had preemptively dispatched the financial crimes unit the moment my grandson flagged the fraudulent wire transfer. I stepped down from the wooden stage, perfectly ready to watch the police put my thieving son in cold metal handcuffs. But the lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe jawline, bypassed the center booth completely. He did not even glance at Marcus or the shattered glass on the floor. He marched straight through the parting crowd of wealthy diners, his eyes locked directly onto me. "Are you Gloria Vance?" the officer asked. His voice was loud, completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from me, his hand hovering near his radio. I nodded, squaring my shoulders and standing as tall as my frame would allow. "I am Gloria Vance," I replied smoothly. "I presume you are here regarding the federal wire fraud and the forged legal documents." The officer shook his head. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thickly folded, officially stamped legal document. "We are here for you, ma'am. We have a court-ordered involuntary psychiatric hold signed by a superior court judge this afternoon. You are being placed under an immediate 72-hour medical committal for severe dementia and violent paranoid delusions. We need you to step onto this gurney and come with us quietly." I froze completely. The cold, horrifying reality of the situation slammed into my chest with the force of a runaway freight train. I looked past the broad shoulders of the police officers. Marcus had stepped out of the booth. The sheer panic from 2 minutes ago had vanished from his face entirely. It was replaced by a dark, incredibly arrogant sociopathic smirk. He stepped forward, putting on a masterful, deeply calculated mask of agonizing sorrow for the watching crowd. "Thank God you made it in time, officers," Marcus said. His voice trembled with perfectly executed fake emotion. "My mother has completely lost her mind. She has been wandering the streets making wild, psychotic accusations about stolen money and offshore accounts. It absolutely breaks my heart to see her deteriorate like this. She is a massive danger to herself and others." Marcus reached into his tailored jacket pocket and handed a secondary manila folder to the paramedics. "Here is her complete medical history and the emergency conservatorship order. My lawyers filed and had approved this morning." My mind raced frantically through the terrifying legal implications of what he had just done. Marcus had not just forged a power of attorney for the bank to steal my money. I had paid off a corrupt county judge to rubber stamp an emergency guardianship order without my presence, without my knowledge, and without a legitimate medical evaluation. This ex parte order literally stripped me of my civil rights. It meant a judge had declared me legally incompetent in the eyes of the state based on a single forged signature from a bribed physician. If those paramedics strapped me to that metal gurney, I would be locked inside a secure psychiatric ward for 72 hours. During those 3 days, I would have zero access to my cellular phone, my corporate lawyers, or the outside world. During those 3 days, Marcus would have total, uncontested legal control over my physical body, my bank accounts, and my entire commercial real estate company. He would drain the remaining $15 million. He would liquidate the commercial properties. He would transfer all the assets to untraceable offshore accounts before I even saw a legitimate doctor to prove my sanity. He was burying me alive using the local legal system as his shovel. I took a sharp step backward, raising my chin defensively. "I am perfectly sane," I told the officers, forcing my voice to remain steady and firm, despite the absolute terror rising in my throat. "This man just committed federal wire fraud and paid a judge to cover his tracks. You need to call my corporate attorney immediately." The lead officer stepped closer, closing the distance between us, his posture hardening. He signaled the paramedics to bring the heavy-wheeled gurney forward. "Ma'am, do not make this difficult for us. We have a signed binding order from a judge. If you do not come willingly and sit on this bed, we are legally authorized to use chemical restraints to subdue you for your own safety and the safety of these patrons." The paramedic stepped up beside the officer. He unzipped a bright orange medical bag and pulled out a long, clear plastic syringe filled with a thick sedative fluid. He flicked the needle with his index finger, preparing to inject me. Marcus watched me from across the room, his eyes gleaming with absolute sickening victory. He silently mouthed the words "you lose" from across the dining room floor. I braced my feet against the hardwood floorboards, clenching my fists at my sides. I prepared to fight the armed officers with my bare hands. I was not going to let them strap me down and steal my life. Suddenly, the heavy swinging double doors of the restaurant kitchen kicked violently open. My grandson Jamal stood in the doorway. He was breathing heavily, a thick black backpack slung over his shoulder. He took one look at the police officers closing in on me with the syringe, and he did not hesitate. Jamal grabbed a massive flaming dessert cart that a waiter had just prepared for a birthday celebration. He shoved the cart with all his strength directly into the heavy velvet drapes lining the back wall of the restaurant. The flames caught the fabric instantly. A massive wall of fire roared up toward the ceiling. The building fire alarms triggered immediately, blaring a high-pitched, ear-shattering siren that vibrated my teeth. A split second later, the emergency sprinkler system overhead violently burst open. Freezing cold, foul-smelling water sprayed violently down onto the dining room floor. Women screamed in pure terror. Men cursed loudly, slipping and sliding on the rapidly flooding marble floor. The restaurant plunged into total darkness as the main electrical breaker tripped from the water damage. The fancy chandeliers died instantly. The only light left in the massive room came from the flashing red strobe lights of the emergency exit signs and the dying flames of the curtains. The police officers flinched hard, raising their hands to shield their eyes from the sudden downpour, totally distracted by the blinding strobe lights and the screaming, panicking crowd. A strong hand clamped fiercely onto my wrist in the darkness. I turned, raising my arm ready to strike, but I recognized Jamal's face illuminated by the flashing red lights. "Grandma, move right now!" he yelled at the top of his lungs over the blaring alarms. I hiked up the heavy, soaking wet skirt of my emerald dress and sprinted after my grandson. We pushed hard through the heavy metal kitchen doors. The kitchen was a total madhouse of shouting chefs slipping on wet grease tiles, abandoning their open stoves to run toward the fire escapes. Sizzling heat radiated from the open industrial ovens. The thick smell of burning steak and spilled frying oil filled the suffocating air. A line cook, carrying a massive metal vat of boiling pasta water, slipped on the flooded floor, the metal crashing loudly against the industrial stove. Jamal yanked my arm, pulling me past a row of stainless steel prep stations, dodging a falling stack of heavy metal pots. My lungs burned. My 75-year-old knees ached with every frantic step on the slippery tile, but adrenaline flooded my veins. We slammed our shoulders into the heavy metal delivery door and burst out into the back alley. The humid Atlanta night air hit my face like a damp towel. My expensive dress was completely soaked, sticking uncomfortably to my skin. My breathing was ragged and shallow, my chest burning violently from the sudden, desperate sprint. A black Uber Sport utility vehicle was idling aggressively next to the overflowing restaurant dumpsters, its hazard lights blinking. Jamal threw open the heavy back door. "Get in! Get in!" he shouted, pushing me physically toward the leather seat. I scrambled inside, pulling my wet dress with me. Jamal dove in right behind me, slamming the car door shut with a loud thud. He yelled at the driver to step on the gas. The heavy tires screeched violently against the wet asphalt pavement, burning rubber. We shot out of the dark alleyway like a bullet, fishtailing hard onto the main avenue, just as 3 more police cruisers swarmed the front entrance of the restaurant, their sirens wailing endlessly into the night sky. I collapsed back against the soft leather seat, trying desperately to catch my breath. I looked down at my shaking, wrinkled hands, at the expensive diamond ring on my finger, at the ruined, soaked fabric of my birthday dress. 10 minutes ago, I was a respected commercial real estate and logistics executive in Atlanta. Now, I was a fleeing fugitive. I was a wanted woman running from a psychiatric hold, legally stripped of my human rights, hiding from the police and my own treacherous son. I stared out the dark-tinted window as the glittering skyline of the city I helped build rolled past me in a blur of neon lights. Marcus thought he had won the war. He thought he had effectively buried me under an inescapable mountain of corrupt legal paperwork and fake medical diagnoses. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing air conditioning of the car cool the sweat dripping down my face. The sheer panic faded entirely, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a cold, deeply calculated, and utterly terrifying wrath. I turned to Jamal in the dark back seat and told him to open his laptop. We had work to do. Jamal did not begin by showing me dramatic code or secret offshore accounts. He showed me something far more useful, the bank alert that had started everything. Earlier that afternoon, while reviewing access logs from his internship, he had noticed Marcus use an executive authentication token from an unfamiliar device. Minutes later, the primary holding account generated an emergency transfer notice carrying the same transaction reference Jamal had already flagged. Jamal knew that any transfer of that size required either my direct biometric approval or a documented incapacity exception. He checked the internal document repository and found a newly uploaded medical power of attorney bearing my name. The signature looked convincing from a distance, but the document metadata showed it had been created that morning from Marcus's office workstation. Jamal immediately called the bank's fraud desk, identified himself as an authorized cybersecurity intern, and asked them to place a temporary review hold on the transfer until my identity could be confirmed. The bank had not reversed the money yet, but it had stopped the funds from leaving the domestic clearing system. That detail mattered. Marcus had not successfully bought a house with settled cash. He had used a bridge closing arrangement that depended on the transfer clearing the next business morning. If we could prove the authorization was fraudulent before the bank's deadline, the closing could be unwound and the money protected. If we failed, the money would move beyond the bank's easiest reach. Then Jamal showed me the second layer. Over the previous 3 months, Marcus had been quietly manufacturing a record of supposed cognitive decline. He had sent emails to senior employees asking them to copy him on routine decisions because, according to him, I had become forgetful. He had rescheduled 2 meetings and later written that I had missed them. He had ordered an assistant to resend a contract I had already signed, then created a note saying I had forgotten doing so. The landscaper incident, the one I had heard him mention over champagne, was part of the same pattern. He had taken a legitimate dispute over an overcharge and rewritten it as evidence that I had paid the same invoice twice. None of those individual lies looked decisive. Together they formed a paper trail designed to make the forged medical opinion seem believable. I felt something colder than anger as I read them. Marcus had not snapped under pressure that afternoon. He had been preparing to erase me for months. I asked Jamal why he had not told me sooner. His hands stopped above the keyboard. For the first time that night, he looked 20 instead of brilliant and fearless. He said he had noticed odd access behavior weeks earlier, but had assumed his father was testing the system or preparing for an audit. He had not wanted to accuse his own father without proof, and he had been afraid I would think he was snooping. I reached across the seat and took his hand. I told him that hesitation did not make him responsible for Marcus's choices. What mattered was that when the evidence became clear, he acted. Then I gave him the rule that had guided every hard decision of my career: never confuse suspicion with proof, and never confuse love with permission. We would not win by shouting louder than Marcus. We would win by building a record so clean that no board member, banker, judge, or prosecutor could pretend not to understand it. From the back seat, I called the bank's 24-hour fraud unit, using the number on my corporate card. I answered identity questions only I could know, and stated clearly that I disputed the transfer, the medical power of attorney, and every incapacity document submitted that day. The fraud officer could not adjudicate the guardianship order over the phone, but she confirmed that the wire remained under enhanced review and that no further release would occur before the morning compliance window without additional verification. I asked her to preserve every call recording login record, signature, image, and device fingerprint connected to the transfer. Jamal wrote down the case number. That single conversation gave us a narrow corridor of time. We were still running from a dangerous state order, but the money was not gone. Marcus believed he had 1 night to complete his takeover. So did we. The driver pulled up to a cinder-block building painted a fading mustard yellow on the corner of Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard. The neon vacancy sign buzzed overhead with a broken pink light illuminating the cracked pavement. I handed the driver a crisp $100 bill from my emergency cash reserve and stepped out of the vehicle. This was the exact street corner where I purchased my first abandoned commercial lot 4 decades ago. The air smelled of heavy exhaust fumes and approaching rain. Jamal followed me out of the sport utility vehicle, his thick black backpack thumping heavily against his spine. We walked into the cramped, dimly lit lobby. The night desk clerk barely looked up from his small television screen as I slid 3 $50 bills across the scratched laminate counter. He handed me a physical brass key attached to a heavy red plastic diamond. Room 112. We walked back outside into the humid night air and navigated the exterior walkway. The wooden door stuck to the frame, requiring a hard shove with my shoulder to break the humid seal. The room smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial pine cleaner. A faded floral bedspread covered a sagging mattress in the center of the space. I closed the door, locked the heavy brass deadbolt, and engaged the metal security chain. Jamal did not wait for any instructions. He immediately cleared the small circular table by the window, sweeping a plastic ice bucket and a stack of local takeout menus onto the stained carpet. He unzipped his bag and pulled out two thick metallic laptops. He set them side by side on the faux wood grain surface. He retrieved a tangled cluster of black cables, a portable cellular router, and a specialized encrypted hard drive. He plugged the power devices into the loose wall outlet near the baseboard. His fingers began flying across the dual keyboards with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. The glowing screens illuminated the dark, dingy room with a sharp blue light. I pulled up the single wooden chair in the room and sat directly beside him. I watched lines of complex green code cascade down the black terminal window of the left monitor. I was reviewing encrypted corporate backups and access records he had preserved during his cybersecurity internship before Marcus could revoke his credentials. "Grandma, I am currently inside his personal encrypted directory." Jamal whispered, his eyes scanning the rapid data flow. "He did not just try to wire your money today. He has been shifting smaller amounts of capital from the secondary corporate operating accounts for the last 11 months. I leaned closer to the glowing screen. "Open the ledger files," I instructed him quietly. "Follow the routing numbers to their final destination." Jamal clicked through a series of highly protected digital folders. A massive financial spreadsheet materialized on the right monitor. It documented Marcus and his personal financial standing over the last 2 years. The numbers were absolutely staggering. He had completely maxed out 7 different platinum-tier credit lines. He had leveraged his own equity in his Buckhead estate to the absolute legal limit through a series of predatory secondary mortgages. He owed $400,000 in immediate short-term high-interest loans to private shadow lenders. He was completely, undeniably bankrupt. "Where is the capital draining to?" I asked, tracing a manicured fingernail along the glowing screen. "Look at the outgoing wire transfer destinations." Jamal isolated a repeating 9-digit international account number. He ran the sequence through a tracing program he developed for his university thesis. The progress bar spun on the screen for 30 agonizing seconds. The result flashed on the monitor in bright white text. The destination was an offshore holding account registered in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation called Azure Investments. "Pull the corporate registration documents for Azure Investments," I ordered. Jamal typed a rapid string of command prompts. A scanned legal document appeared. The primary signatory and sole financial beneficiary of Azure Investments was Vivian Carmichael, the woman whose lavish lifestyle Marcus was desperately trying to fund. Jamal opened a hidden correspondence folder buried deep in the partitioned section of Marcus's hard drive. He pulled up a lengthy chain of encrypted emails between Marcus and a man named Silas Thorne, a notorious underground broker based out of Miami. I read the emails line by line, absorbing the horrifying reality of my son's situation. The correspondence made it look at first as though Vivian had buried herself under gambling and speculative investment debts. Marcus clearly believed that story. He had been told that $2 million was owed to dangerous private lenders and that the family would face consequences if the balance was not settled. Under that pressure, and driven by his own arrogance, he began moving smaller amounts from company accounts into Azure Investments, believing a high-yield offshore strategy would restore the money before the quarterly review. Instead, the money disappeared. The lenders demanded immediate payment. Marcus, already terrified of exposure for the earlier transfers, decided the only way to cover the hole and protect himself was to seize my primary commercial trust fund in one massive final transaction. At that point, I still did not know the full truth behind Azure Investments, but I knew my son had crossed from desperation into deliberate criminal betrayal. Jamal minimized the devastating financial documents and opened Marcus's corporate email client. A red notification pinged in the top corner of the screen. Marcus had just sent an urgent, high-priority message to the 5 senior members of the Vance Logistics Board of Directors. The subject line read, "Emergency Liquidation and Leadership Transfer Protocol." I told Jamal to open the attached document. A formal legal agenda populated the screen. Marcus had scheduled an emergency boardroom meeting for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The agenda detailed a formal motion to invoke the incapacity clause outlined in Section 4 of our corporate bylaws. He had attached the forged medical evaluation, declaring me completely mentally unfit to manage the daily operations of the company. He planned to present the fraudulent document to the board of directors, secure a majority vote to officially strip me of my title as chief executive officer, and instantly appoint himself as the sole acting director of Vance Logistics. Once the board ratified the medical directive, Marcus intended to use the resulting authority to force the blocked transfer through and gain control of the remaining accounts. Marcus would liquidate my remaining liquid assets by noon, pay off the cartel debt, and leave me entirely destitute. I checked the digital clock on the bottom corner of the laptop screen. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. We had exactly 8 hours before the board convened in the glass conference room on the 40th floor of my commercial building. I stood up from the wooden chair and began pacing the narrow strip of stained carpet at the foot of the sagging bed. "We cannot simply walk into that meeting and claim the medical documents are fake," I said, structuring our tactical response aloud. "Marcus will bring the corrupt judge's physical court order. The board members will be forced to comply with the legal paperwork, regardless of what I say in my own defense. The corporate bylaws mandate strict adherence to judicial directives. We need undeniable physical proof that the medical directive is a complete forgery manufactured on company property. We need the raw metadata logs from his specific office terminal to prove he authored the document himself." Jamal turned away from the glowing monitors and looked up at me. "Grandma, those specific access logs are stored on the isolated internal server. I cannot access that specific subnet remotely from this motel room. The corporate system is hardwired to prevent any external network penetration. The only way to retrieve the unedited timestamp data showing he manufactured the medical documents on his office computer is to physically plug a decryptor drive directly into the main server rack. The server rack is located behind a biometric lock in the secured basement of the Vance Logistics corporate headquarters." I stopped pacing and looked out the dirty motel window into the dark, rain-slicked alleyway. Marcus would have already deactivated my administrative keycard. He would have undoubtedly placed the night shift security team on high alert, instructing them to deny me entry to the premises under the guise of my supposed mental breakdown. He believed he had effectively locked me out of my own fortress. He failed to realize I possessed something far more valuable than a piece of plastic. I built that skyscraper from the ground up. I approved every single architectural blueprint, every electrical conduit, and every structural ventilation shaft. I knew the exact blind spots in the security grid because I personally signed off on the camera placements 15 years ago. I turned back to my grandson. "Pack up your equipment, Jamal. We are leaving this room at 5:30 in the morning. We are going to break into my own corporate building, and we are going to extract the digital execution warrant he wrote for himself." Before either of us tried to sleep, I made 3 decisions that separated a desperate escape from an actual strategy. First, Jamal duplicated every file he had preserved and sealed one copy on an encrypted drive that neither of us would carry into the building. We placed it in the motel office safe under a receipt in my name, so Marcus could not erase our entire case by taking one laptop. Second, I called Harrison, Evelyn, and Thomas, the 3 original founding partners. I did not give them a dramatic speech. I told them only that an emergency board meeting had been called on the basis of a disputed incapacity order, that I had evidence of financial misconduct, and that I needed them physically present before any vote occurred. They had enough history with me to understand the seriousness of that request. Each of them agreed to come. Third, I dictated a written statement for Jamal to timestamp and send to a secure corporate archive. In it, I stated that I was competent, that I disputed the unauthorized transfer and every medical document submitted in my name, and that I was appearing voluntarily to preserve the company. I knew a statement would not defeat a court order by itself, but it would make it much harder for Marcus to claim later that nobody had been warned. Only after those safeguards were in place did I allow myself to sit on the edge of the sagging motel bed. The room was quiet, except for the air conditioner rattling in the window. I looked at the water stains on my emerald dress and thought about how quickly status can disappear. Hours earlier, people had stood when I entered conference rooms. Now the state considered me potentially incompetent because my son had learned which forms to file and which fears to exploit. That was the lesson beneath all the money power that depends on other people believing you are powerful can vanish in a day. Records, ownership, witnesses, and carefully drafted rules endure longer. I had spent 40 years building those things. Marcus had spent 1 year assuming they belonged to him because he expected me to die before he had to understand them. At 4:30, Jamal finally closed one laptop and rested his forehead against his hands. I told him to sleep for 40 minutes. He refused until I promised I would wake him. While he slept, I sat by the window and reviewed the bylaws from memory. Section 4 allowed temporary leadership transfer if a chief executive became legally incapacitated. Marcus knew that provision because I had taught it to him, but he had apparently forgotten the restrictions elsewhere in the charter: major asset pledges required, founding partner approval related, party transactions required disclosure, and any executive who concealed a conflict could have his authority suspended pending review. Those clauses would not automatically solve the guardianship problem, but they could stop the company from becoming his personal checking account. By dawn, I no longer needed to beat Marcus at every game he had started. I only needed to force all of his games into the same room in front of people who could compare the paperwork side by side. The rain had finally stopped by the time Jamal and I pulled into the damp service alley behind the Vance Logistics corporate headquarters. The massive steel and glass structure loomed above us, piercing the dark, heavy gray morning sky like a jagged knife. I knew every single inch of that loading dock because I had personally negotiated the concrete pouring contracts 40 years ago when this empire was nothing more than an ambitious dream written on a stained diner napkin. I walked directly past the main delivery bays to a recessed utility panel hidden carefully behind a row of commercial dumpsters. I reached into my leather clutch and pulled out a small silver master skeleton key, sliding it into the manual override slot. Marcus thought that deactivating my digital executive keycard would lock me out of my own fortress. He fundamentally failed to account for the analog fail-safes I had permanently installed before smart technology even existed in this city. The heavy steel freight doors ground open with a deep mechanical groan that echoed against the wet brick walls of the alleyway. We stepped into the freezing, dimly lit service corridor. Jamal moved silently beside me, his thick black backpack heavy with specialized decryption hardware and portable server routers. We bypassed the opulent main lobby, entirely taking the concrete service stairwell down into the sub-basement where the primary corporate server farm was securely housed. The biometric scanner mounted on the wall glowed an angry solid red when we approached the reinforced frosted glass doors. Marcus had systematically purged my administrative fingerprints from the primary security registry. I did not panic. I simply reached down to the secondary maintenance terminal, hidden beneath a loose floor tile, flipped the gray plastic access cover, and typed in a complex 6-digit alphanumeric sequence known exclusively to the original building architect and myself. The heavy magnetic locks disengaged instantly with a loud, satisfying metallic click. We slipped quietly into the freezing, climate-controlled room. Rows of massive black server racks hummed loudly all around us, blinking with thousands of green and amber data lights representing the lifeblood of my company. Jamal immediately dropped to his knees and connected a thick yellow Ethernet cable from his laptop directly into the primary switchboard. His fingers flew across the backlit keyboard, typing rapid complex terminal commands to bypass the internal corporate encryption protocols. I stood guard by the frosted glass door, watching the dark, empty hallway for any sign of movement. My heart beat a steady, rhythmic, and furious drum against my ribs. "I have the workstation trail," Jamal whispered over the cooling fans. "I am isolating the exact sequence that links Dad's office terminal to the forged filing. I am isolating the exact digital pathway Dad used to generate that fraudulent medical committal order." Jamal routed the raw data through a sophisticated decoding sequence he had built for his university classes. Lines of bright green text cascaded rapidly down his monitor. "Got it," he said, his voice thick with sudden vindication and adrenaline. The forged psychiatric evaluation was completely drafted, digitally signed, and officially submitted to the county court using the static Internet Protocol address assigned directly to Dad's corner office desktop. I am downloading the raw metadata logs to an encrypted external flash drive right now. This is undeniable federal-level proof of digital forgery and wire fraud occurring directly on company property. Just as the blue progress bar on his screen hit 90%, the heavy thud of tactical boots echoed loudly down the concrete hallway outside. Two private security contractors men Marcus had specifically hired just last week to replace my trusted longtime guards rounded the corner, holding large, heavy-duty flashlights. "Hey!" one of the guards shouted, shining the blinding white beam directly at the server room glass. "Nobody is allowed down here at this hour. Step away from the server hardware and put your hands where I can see them." I did not flinch, and I certainly did not raise my hands. I pushed open the glass door and stepped directly into the blinding beam of light, standing completely straight in my ruined, water-stained emerald dress. I looked the taller guard directly in the eyes with absolute unyielding authority. I asked him if he knew exactly whose name was signed at the bottom of the paychecks for his private security firm. I informed him that his employer, Vanguard Protection Services, held a lucrative commercial contract with Vance Logistics that I had personally negotiated and renewed last November. The guard lowered his flashlight slightly, suddenly recognizing my face from the massive oil portrait hanging in the main executive lobby upstairs. I told him he had exactly two choices this morning. He could either actively assist in an illegal corporate coup orchestrated by a man who was about to be indicted for federal wire fraud, or he could turn around, walk back up those concrete stairs, and pretend he saw absolutely nothing down here. The two guards exchanged a nervous, terrified glance. They clearly realized they were standing between the founder of the company and an internal power struggle they had no authority to adjudicate. They turned around and walked away quickly without uttering a single word. Jamal pulled the silver flash drive from the server rack and shoved it deep into his pocket. We finally had the physical ammunition we needed. Now it was time to execute the war. I did not go up to the executive boardroom immediately. I led Jamal back out through the freight elevator and into the underground executive parking garage. We waited in the cold, damp morning air as 3 black luxury sedans pulled simultaneously into the secured, reserved parking spots. The doors opened, and 3 elderly, impeccably dressed individuals stepped out into the dim garage light. Harrison stepped out first, followed by Evelyn and Thomas. All 3 had been with me since the years when Vance Logistics was still fighting for regional contracts. I had called them from the rundown motel room 2 hours ago. I made these people multimillionaires back in the 1990s, when we aggressively secured the regional distribution routes for the entire Southeast Corridor. They owed me their careers, their massive fortunes, and their absolute, unquestioning loyalty. They walked toward me with grim, stony, and furious expressions. I handed Harrison a printed copy of the raw server logs Jamal had just extracted from the basement. Harrison adjusted his gold-rimmed reading glasses, scanned the technical data carefully, and shook his head in absolute visceral disgust. He looked at me, his jaw set hard, and said it was time to remove the parasitic infection from our building once and for all. The digital clock inside the glass elevator read exactly 9 o'clock in the morning as we ascended rapidly to the 40th floor. The heavy carved mahogany doors of the executive boardroom were closed tight. Through the thick soundproof glass walls flanking the doors, I could see the entire board of directors seated formally around the massive oval conference table. Marcus was standing right at the head of the table wearing a pristine charcoal suit, looking the picture of corporate stability. Chloe sat to his immediate right, dabbing her dry eyes with a white tissue, playing the role of the devastated, supportive, and grieving wife. Vivian sat comfortably in a plush leather corner chair, sipping sparkling water from a crystal glass, as if she were already the undisputed queen of the castle. Marcus was in the middle of a prepared speech. I could read his deceptive body language perfectly from the hallway. He was bowing his head, pressing his hand to his chest, putting on a sickening theatrical display of profound, agonizing grief. He was projecting a slide onto the main presentation screen, showing the forged psychiatric evaluation to the room. He was formally asking the board to ratify the fake medical order, strip me of my title, and hand him the absolute keys to the kingdom. I did not bother to knock. I placed both of my hands flat against the heavy glass doors and shoved them open with tremendous, unbridled force. The doors slammed violently against the interior walls with an explosive, deafening crash that shook the room. The entire boardroom jumped in sheer collective panic. Marcus spun around so fast he dropped the digital laser pointer from his hand. It clattered loudly onto the polished wood table and rolled onto the floor. Chloe gasped sharply, dropping her tissue into her lap. Vivian choked on her sparkling water, coughing violently into her manicured hands. I marched straight into the center of the boardroom, flanked entirely by the 3 founding partners and my grandson. The current board members stared at me in total, absolute shock. They had just been told by their chief operating officer that I was wandering the dangerous streets of Atlanta in a violent, psychotic, and delusional haze. Yet here I stood radiating absolute authority, sharp intelligence, and terrifying composure. Marcus lunged forward, his face twisting instantly into a mask of desperate, aggressive rage. "Security!" he screamed toward the open hallway, his voice cracking violently with fear. "I specifically ordered security to keep this delusional woman out of the building today. She is having a severe psychotic breakdown. Do not look at her. Do not listen to anything she says." I stepped directly up to the edge of the conference table, ignoring his pathetic outburst. I reached into my clutch, pulled out the thick stack of raw Internet Protocol logs Jamal had printed, and slammed them down onto the polished wood with a loud, aggressive smack. I looked around the silent room, making direct, piercing eye contact with every single executive seated at the table. I told them they were currently entertaining a corporate motion presented by a desperate, bankrupt, and highly sloppy criminal. I pointed a steady, manicured finger directly at the stack of papers on the table. I announced loudly that the documents sitting before them contained undeniable raw server metadata, proving that the medical evaluation currently displayed on the presentation screen was a complete, fabricated forgery. I explained methodically that the psychiatric order was authored, formatted, and officially submitted from the exact Internet Protocol address assigned to Marcus's personal desktop computer in the executive office right down the hall. I told the stunned board that the metadata before them linked Marcus's office terminal to the disputed filing, and that the banking records showed an unauthorized transaction initiated under the same false claim of incapacity. I did not ask them to accept my anger as evidence. I asked them to compare the timestamps. The boardroom erupted into immediate chaotic and furious shouting. Calvin, the chief financial officer, grabbed the server log, scanning the technical data with widening, horrified eyes. He looked up at Marcus, his face pale, and demanded an immediate explanation for the forged routing numbers and the fake medical stamps. Harrison, my oldest founding partner, slammed his heavy wooden cane against the floor to demand total silence from the room. He pointed his cane directly at Marcus's chest and announced a formal, immediate motion to terminate the chief operating officer for gross corporate malfeasance, massive embezzlement, and federal wire fraud. The remaining board members murmured in rapid, aggressive, and unanimous agreement. Marcus backed away from the table, his chest heaving rapidly, cold sweat pouring down his face, realizing his entire corporate coup had just imploded in a spectacular, profoundly public fashion. He looked completely and utterly destroyed, trapped in a cage of his own making. But then a sharp, piercing sound cut through the angry shouting of the executives. It was a laugh, a loud, incredibly arrogant, and highly grating laugh. I turned toward the corner of the room. Vivian was sitting back in the plush leather chair, casually swirling the remaining sparkling water in her crystal glass. Whatever fear Vivian had shown the night before was gone. In the boardroom, she wore the composure of someone who believed the paperwork had made her untouchable. She stood up slowly, deliberately brushing a piece of invisible lint from her expensive designer skirt. She walked over to the conference table with a sickening, triumphant, and highly calculated swagger. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out a separate, heavily notarized legal folder wrapped in a thick rubber band. She tossed it casually onto the center of the table, right on top of my server logs, silencing the room completely. Vivian smiled, looking directly into my eyes with pure, venomous, and unadulterated malice. She told the board of directors that they could not fire Marcus under any circumstances. She explained smoothly that firing Marcus would trigger an immediate catastrophic default on a massive, highly sensitive corporate loan. I stared at her, narrowing my eyes, calculating her angle. I asked her what specific corporate loan she was talking about. Vivian leaned forward, tapping her long, painted acrylic fingernails aggressively against the manila folder. She announced to the room that Marcus had already leveraged the entire company to save his own skin. She explained that yesterday afternoon, utilizing his broad executive authority as the chief operating officer, Marcus had legally pledged 51% of the company's total liquid operating assets as collateral to secure a massive private loan from her personal offshore investment firm, Azure Investments. The massive boardroom went completely and utterly dead silent again. Calvin, the chief financial officer, grabbed the new folder with trembling hands, ripping it open and scanning the densely packed legal contract. His face went completely pale, looking as though he might physically faint. He looked over at me, his hands shaking slightly, and confirmed that the contract appeared to be completely legally binding. Marcus had signed a desperate, high-interest collateral pledge without consulting the board. Vivian sneered, her voice dripping with absolute arrogant victory and terrible cruelty. She explained the poison clause buried deep in the fine print of the paperwork. She told the stunned room that if Marcus was terminated, investigated by authorities, or removed from his executive position on the board of directors for any reason whatsoever, the offshore loan would instantly default. If the loan defaulted, her investment firm had the immediate, uncontestable legal right to seize 51% of the company's operating capital to cover the damages. Vivian crossed her arms confidently, looking around the devastated, silent boardroom. She told the highly paid executives that they had a very simple, very unfortunate choice to make this morning. They could fire her son-in-law right now and watch her legally drain half of their corporate wealth by tomorrow morning, destroying their pensions and their stock options, or they could sit down, shut up, ratify the fake medical conservatorship, and let Marcus take over the company in absolute peace. Chloe stood up proudly beside her husband, a smug, vicious smile returning to her face. She looked at me and told me I put up a very good fight for an old woman, but it was finally time for me to go to a nursing home where I truly belonged. Marcus straightened his posture, trying desperately to reclaim his shattered dignity, confident that his ruthless mother-in-law had just saved his entire criminal scheme with her predatory contract. They stood together, a united front of greed, completely convinced they had backed me into an inescapable, fatal legal corner. They thought they had successfully held my entire life's work hostage. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 40 years building silent, devastating legal traps designed specifically for greedy, arrogant parasites exactly like them. I let my shoulders collapse forward intentionally, breaking the rigid, unyielding posture that had commanded this very boardroom for 4 consecutive decades. I allowed my chin to tremble, channeling every ounce of genuine physical exhaustion I felt from the long night into a masterful performance of absolute catastrophic defeat. I looked down at the polished mahogany table, letting my vision blur naturally until genuine tears pooled in the corners of my eyes and spilled over my lashes. Calvin and Harrison watched me with deep, uncomfortable pity, etching deep lines across their faces. They truly thought they were witnessing the tragic final defeat of a legendary commercial real estate matriarch. I needed them to believe it completely. I needed my son to believe it without a single shred of doubt. I reached out with a violently shaking hand and grasped the edge of the heavy leather chair for support. I looked up at Marcus, letting the tears track slowly down my cheeks, ruining my carefully applied makeup. I begged him. I told him he had won the war. I told him he had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner with his offshore collateral trap and his fraudulent medical directive. My voice wavered, perfectly cracking hard on the consonants as I spoke. I asked him to call off the paramedics who were still waiting down in the lobby with their chemical sedatives. I pleaded with him not to execute the involuntary psychiatric hold, begging him not to lock me inside a sterile white room and strip away my remaining dignity. I told him I would sign the mediation papers tomorrow morning without any further resistance. I offered to step down formally as chief executive officer and hand him the keys to the entire corporate empire provided he let me walk out of this building a free woman. Marcus exhaled a massive, shuddering breath of profound relief. He straightened his ruined charcoal suit jacket, rolling his shoulders back to reclaim his stolen authority in front of the silent board of directors. He walked slowly around the massive conference table, stopping just inches from my chair. He did not offer me a comforting hand or a word of apology. He looked down at me with cold, clinical detachment. He addressed the board members, declaring that this was a tragic but entirely necessary transition of corporate power to save the logistics firm from my rapidly failing mind. He instructed Calvin to immediately draft the binding separation agreements, demanding that the paperwork transfer total executive control and absolute signatory power over all liquid commercial assets directly to him. He mandated that the transition documents include an irrevocable ironclad waiver, permanently revoking my right to sue him, his wife, or his investment partners for any past financial discrepancies. I nodded slowly, staring blankly at the floorboards, keeping my hands folded weakly in my lap like a defeated prisoner. I told him I would sign whatever legal documents he required, as long as the 72-hour medical committal order was physically shredded in front of me. Marcus smiled. It was a terrifying, completely hollow expression devoid of any human empathy. He told me the psychiatric medical hold would remain fully active and legally binding until his ink dried on the final corporate transfer documents. I was intentionally keeping the threat of the psychiatric ward functioning as a loaded gun pressed firmly against my temple to ensure my absolute unquestioning compliance over the next 24 hours. Chloe stepped forward, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She crossed her arms over her chest, looking down at my tear-stained face with a mask of absolute undisguised disgust. She told me it was completely pathetic that it took the imminent threat of a padded cell and a chemical straitjacket to finally make me relinquish control of a company I was entirely too old and too senile to manage. She openly mocked the state of my emerald green dress, stating loudly that the fabric was wrinkled, ruined by the sprinkler system, and smelled like an alleyway dumpster. She leaned down, bringing her face mere inches from mine, her heavy, expensive perfume suffocating the stagnant air between us. She whispered harshly that she would personally oversee the clearing out of my corner executive office. She outlined her plan to throw my 4 decades of industry awards, mayoral commendations, and personal photographs straight into the industrial trash compactor by noon tomorrow. She said she was bringing in an interior decorator to replace my antique oak furniture with modern glass and steel to erase my memory from the building entirely. Vivian walked up right beside her daughter, swirling her sparkling water with a victorious, highly predatory rhythm. Vivian announced to the silent room that a simple boardroom signing was far too boring and entirely too sterile for such a momentous transfer of generational wealth. She demanded that the formal execution of the separation agreements take place tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. She dictated the exact location for the surrender. We would meet at her newly purchased multi-million-dollar beachfront mansion in Savannah. The very same luxury property Marcus had illegally purchased just hours ago using my stolen retirement funds. Vivian wanted to physically watch me sign away my entire life's work while sitting in the lavish living room I had unknowingly paid for. She bragged about the vaulted ceilings and the imported Italian marble floors her new home possessed. She smirked, telling me to enjoy knitting in my modest retirement home because my days of commercial relevance and financial power were permanently over. I did not argue with their vicious demands. I kept my head bowed low, playing the role of the broken, deeply humiliated mother to absolute perfection. I whispered my quiet agreement to their location and their timeline. I stood up from the leather executive chair, moving with a deliberate, fragile slowness that made me look 10 years older than I actually was. I leaned heavily on my grandson Jamal, wrapping my arm around his strong, sturdy shoulder. Jamal supported my weight instantly, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched visibly in his cheek. He played his part brilliantly, guiding me toward the shattered glass doors of the boardroom like a careful nurse aiding a terminal hospital patient. Marcus warned me not to try anything foolish, reminding me with a harsh tone that the armed police officers were still stationed in the main lobby, waiting for his signal to deploy the paramedics. I did not look back at him or acknowledge his threat. I let Jamal lead me out of the devastated room, down the long, carpeted executive hallway, and straight into the private corporate elevator. The exact millisecond, the heavy brass elevator doors locked into place, sealing us inside the descending steel box. My tears vanished entirely. I stood up perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back until my spine popped loudly. The feigned fragility and manufactured weakness evaporated from my bones like morning mist burning off hot asphalt. I wiped the remaining moisture from my cheeks with the back of my hand. My face turned to absolute unforgiving stone. Jamal let go of my arm immediately, dropping his heavy black backpack to the floor to retrieve his encrypted laptop. He flipped the screen open, balancing the machine on his knee as the elevator descended. He rapidly typed a command prompt, pulling up the exact geographic coordinates of the beachfront mansion in Savannah. He looked up at me, a sharp, incredibly dangerous smile spreading across his young face as he confirmed the property was fully registered under Vivian's name. I reached deep into my leather clutch and pulled out my cellular phone. I did not call my corporate attorneys. I did not call the local police department to report the extortion. I scrolled past my immediate business contacts and manually dialed a highly secure unlisted phone number I had memorized over 15 years ago for an absolute worst-case scenario. The encrypted line rang twice. A deep, gravelly voice answered on the third ring. It was my longtime outside counsel, a fiercely intelligent retired federal prosecutor who had built his career dismantling organized financial crime and later advised my company on emergency governance and asset protection procedures. I did not offer any polite pleasantries. I did not say hello or ask how his retirement was going. I stared directly at the descending floor numbers flashing in bright red digital lights above the elevator doors. I told him to gather his forensic accounting team and prepare the federal injunction paperwork immediately. I gripped the phone tighter, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. I told the retired prosecutor that it was finally time to trigger the poison pill. The heavy brass doors of the corporate elevator slid open with a soft mechanical chime revealing the damp, concrete expanse of the underground parking garage. The freezing morning air rushed into the cabin, biting at the soaked fabric of my ruined emerald dress. I stepped out into the dim fluorescent light, my posture rigid, my mind operating with the cold, unforgiving calculation of a wartime general. Jamal followed closely behind me, his black backpack slung tightly over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the shadowed rows of concrete pillars for any lingering private security contractors. I kept the encrypted cellular phone pressed firmly against my ear. On the other end of the secure line, my retired federal prosecutor listened in absolute heavy silence as I outlined the catastrophic legal extortion my son had just executed in the 40th floor boardroom. I did not need to explain the intricacies of commercial real estate law to a man who had spent 3 decades dismantling organized financial crime syndicates across the southern states. I simply gave him the authorization he had been waiting to hear for over 10 years. I told him Marcus had pledged a controlling share of our liquid assets to Azure Investments without the approvals required by our charter, and that tomorrow's signing had been designed to make the arrangement look final. I gave him the time and place. Then I used the phrase he had helped me draft years earlier, Article 7. A low, dark chuckle rumbled through the phone speaker. It was the sound of a predator, recognizing that the prey had just willingly stepped into a steel-jawed trap. They have no idea what is buried in the foundational ink of your company bylaws. The retired prosecutor replied, his voice thick with grim satisfaction. I will mobilize my forensic accounting team immediately. We will meet you at the secure secondary office in Midtown. Bring the boy and his laptop. We have federal documents to draft. I ended the call and slid the phone back into my leather clutch. My driver Thomas was already idling the black sport utility vehicle near the service exit, the engine purring with quiet, contained power. Jamal opened the heavy armored door for me, and we climbed into the luxurious climate-controlled interior. As the vehicle accelerated up the concrete ramp and merged onto the busy, sunlit streets of downtown Atlanta, I turned to my grandson. His brow was furrowed in deep concentration, his hands resting on the closed lid of his laptop. He looked at me, his young face tight with unresolved anxiety. "Grandma, I do not understand," Jamal said, keeping his voice low, so as not to distract the driver. Vivian produced a legally binding collateral pledge in front of the entire board of directors. Dad signed it using his active credentials as chief operating officer. If we fire him, or if we attempt to report the wire fraud to the authorities, her offshore investment firm has the absolute legal right to instantly seize half of your commercial empire. How does a federal prosecutor fix a binding corporate contract? I looked out the tinted window at the towering glass skyscrapers I had spent 40 years helping to construct. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my skirt and allowed a sharp, lethal smile to cross my face. Because Jamal, I explained, my voice dropping to a calm, instructional register. A contract is only as binding as the foundational bylaws of the corporation it represents. 10 years ago, when your father first started demanding more unilateral executive control over our commercial acquisitions, I foresaw the possibility that his overwhelming greed might one day compromise our security. I hired that retired federal prosecutor, one of the sharpest financial crime lawyers I had ever met, to quietly restructure the absolute core of Vance Logistics. We buried a highly classified, heavily encrypted legal mechanism deep within the foundational corporate charter. It sits in a restricted schedule to the charter that ordinary operating reports never display, but it is binding on every executive who accepts signatory authority. We call it the poison pill. Jamal adjusted his glasses, leaning forward with intense forensic curiosity. "How exactly does it work?" he asked, his mind already dissecting the legal mechanics. "It is a defensive governance failsafe designed to stop an executive from pledging the company to an unapproved outside creditor," I explained. "If any executive attempts to encumber more than 20% of our liquid operating assets through an offshore or high-risk collateral agreement without unanimous written consent from the founding partners, Article 7 automatically suspends that executive's authority and moves the affected assets into an independent protective trust pending judicial review. The outside creditor cannot simply seize the company because the collateral pledge becomes subject to the pre-existing charter restriction. More importantly, the executive who made the unauthorized pledge is personally responsible under a separate indemnity covenant for losses caused by the attempted transaction. That covenant had been signed years earlier as a condition of Marcus receiving expanded signatory power. I watched the realization slowly begin to dawn in my grandson's eyes. Jamal read the charter language twice, then looked up. He finally understood that tomorrow's signatures would not magically hand anyone a fortune. They would create a clean record of who knowingly tried to exercise unauthorized power after the charter restrictions had been triggered. That was all I needed him to understand. The rest would belong to trustees, lawyers, and eventually a court. The vehicle pulled into the secured underground parking garage of a nondescript commercial building in Midtown. We took a private, keycard-restricted elevator directly to the top floor. The doors opened to reveal a sprawling high-tech command center. Wall-mounted digital monitors displayed complex financial webs routing numbers and global market feeds. My retired federal prosecutor stood at the head of a long glass table, flanked by 3 serious-looking forensic accountants wearing dark suits. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He approached me immediately, taking my hand in a firm, respectful grip. "Gloria," he said, his gravelly voice filled with quiet respect, "it is an absolute tragedy that it has come to this, but the documentation is already being prepared. We have drafted the surrender agreements exactly to your son's arrogant specifications. We gave him the executive signatory power he demanded, and we included the liability waivers he requested." I walked over to the glass table and examined the thick stacks of legal paperwork spread across the surface. "And the trigger mechanism?" I asked, tracing a manicured finger over the signature lines. I asked him one question before I touched the packet: whether Marcus and Vivian would be able to see every cross-reference that mattered if they bothered to read what they were signing. The prosecutor turned the pages toward me and showed the charter citations, the indemnity covenant, and the trust schedule printed in ordinary black type. Nothing was hidden behind a trick clause or a false page. That mattered because I wanted their downfall to come from their own informed arrogance, not from anything that could later be described as deception on my part. I nodded, satisfied with the meticulous legal craftsmanship. I turned to Jamal, who had already claimed a seat at the end of the table, and opened his laptop. He was plugging a secondary encrypted hard drive into his machine. His eyes narrowed in absolute unbroken focus. "Jamal, I need to know exactly who we are dealing with," I commanded, pulling out a leather chair and sitting beside him. "Vivian claimed her offshore firm, Azure Investments, provided the initial capital that your father desperately needed to cover his catastrophic losses. I want to know exactly where that money originated. I want you to tear her digital life apart down to the foundational code. I am already bypassing the secondary proxy servers," Jamal replied, his fingers moving with blinding, furious speed across the mechanical keyboard. She routed the initial transactions through a labyrinth of shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and the Isle of Man. It is a highly sophisticated digital laundering technique, but it leaves residual transaction signatures if you know exactly how to reverse engineer the blockchain hashes. The room fell into a tense, heavy silence, broken only by the rapid, staccato clicking of Jamal's keyboard and the low hum of the massive cooling towers powering the command center's servers. The 3 forensic accountants stood behind him, watching his screen with undisguised professional awe as the 20-year-old college student systematically dismantled an international financial firewall that would have taken a federal agency weeks to crack. "I am penetrating the core ledger of Azure Investments now," Jamal announced, his voice tight with rising adrenaline. "I am isolating the primary deposit sources. The capital did not come from gambling debts, Grandma. She lied to Dad." I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the massive columns of incoming wire transfers flooding the screen. "What do you mean she lied to him? Where is the money coming from?" Jamal rapidly cross-referenced a series of encrypted routing numbers against a classified database he had quietly accessed through his university's cybersecurity portal. His face drained of color entirely. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden profound realization of absolute danger. Grandma Vivian is not a chronic gambling addict, Jamal said, his voice dropping to a terrified, hushed whisper. She is a professional, high-level money launderer. These incoming wire transfers are originating from a highly organized, heavily monitored criminal syndicate operating out of South America. She has been taking millions of dollars in illicit drug money, running it through her offshore shell corporations, and aggressively forcing Dad to inject the dirty capital directly into Vance Logistics' clean commercial real estate acquisitions to wash the money for the cartel. A suffocating, heavy silence blanketed the room. The retired federal prosecutor stepped forward, his expression turning to stone as he verified the routing numbers on Jamal's screen. The retired prosecutor stepped forward, but instead of repeating Jamal's conclusion, he asked everyone in the room to stop touching the source files. He photographed the screen, recorded the time, and directed one of the forensic accountants to create read-only copies of the ledger data so the original records could be preserved. He warned Jamal that discovering something explosive was not the same as proving it in court. From that moment forward, every file had to be hashed, logged, and handed to investigators through a clean chain of custody. Jamal nodded and immediately began building the evidence package. Watching him shift from furious grandson to disciplined analyst steadied me. We did not need another speech about what Vivian had done. We needed records that could survive hostile lawyers, skeptical judges, and federal agents who owed me no favors. The sheer horrifying magnitude of the betrayal settled deep into my bones. My son was not just a greedy, arrogant thief trying to steal his mother's retirement fund. I was a profoundly stupid, easily manipulated pawn who had actively tied my clean 40-year-old commercial legacy directly to a lethal international crime syndicate. He was perfectly willing to hand over $15 million of my hard-earned corporate capital to violent criminals just to save his pretentious, manipulative mother-in-law and protect his own fraudulent career. I stood up from the leather chair. I did not feel fear. I did not feel sorrow for the boy I had raised. I felt an absolute, terrifyingly calm resolve. They thought they were forcing an old, senile woman to surrender her kingdom. They did not realize they were actively trying to hand my castle over to murderers. Print the final surrender documents, I commanded the prosecutor, my voice echoing with lethal, unyielding authority. Ensure the poison pill trigger is absolutely flawless. I am not just going to fire my son tomorrow morning. I am going to let him and his mother-in-law sign their own documentary admissions. I want them to absorb every single dime of that $15 million cartel debt personally. I turned to Jamal, who was staring at me with a mixture of awe and fear. Jamal, I want you to package every single piece of data you just extracted from those offshore accounts. We are not just going to Savannah to sign papers. We are going to hand the Federal Bureau of Investigation a complete evidentiary package for an independent racketeering and money laundering investigation. The prosecutor nodded grimly, gathering the thick stacks of legal paperwork from the glass table. The documents are ready, Gloria. Once they sign their own representations, authority claims and indemnity obligations will be fixed in writing for any court or investigator to examine. I corrected one thing before we left that office. I did not want a trick document that could be attacked later as fraud on our side. Every page Marcus and Vivian would sign had to say exactly what it meant, even if they were too arrogant to read it. The retired prosecutor agreed. He removed any language that could be characterized as concealment and replaced it with plain cross-references to Article 7, the existing indemnity covenant, and the independent trust schedule. The trap was not that we lied to them. The trap was that they believed rules did not apply to them and would sign accurate documents without reading the consequences. That distinction mattered to me. I was willing to be ruthless, but I would not become Marcus in order to defeat him. The prosecutor also explained what had happened with the psychiatric order overnight. Jamal's preserved metadata, my recorded fraud complaint to the bank, and the founding partners' sworn statements were enough for counsel to seek emergency review. A state judge had not yet vacated the order, but enforcement had been temporarily stayed pending an adversarial hearing because substantial questions existed about the physician affidavit and the circumstances under which the order had been obtained. That was why no officers had dragged me out of the boardroom that morning despite Marcus's threats. His paperwork still existed, but it was no longer an unquestioned weapon. Separately, the prosecutor had forwarded the bank and server evidence to federal financial crimes investigators. They would not arrest anyone merely because I wanted revenge. They would verify the routing records, the shell entities, and the source of the funds themselves. If those records confirmed what Jamal had found, they would seek warrants through their own process. That was the part Marcus never understood. He believed authority was a matter of possessing the right title at the right moment. Real authority is slower and less glamorous. It is signatures that can be authenticated procedures that survive hostile scrutiny, independent witnesses who have no reason to lie, and institutions that can check one another. I had spent decades resenting how slow those systems could be when I was a young woman trying to borrow money. That night I was grateful for the same slowness because it forced everyone, including me, to prove what we claimed. By the time we drove toward the coast, the company assets were protected, the disputed wire was frozen, the state order was under review, and federal investigators were examining the offshore trail. The meeting at the mansion was no longer about whether I could save myself. It was about whether Marcus and Vivian, given one final chance to read the truth in front of them, would still choose greed. I picked up a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from the desk. I meticulously signed my name on the initial relinquishment clauses, officially preparing the bait for the trap. I carefully placed the lethal documents into my leather clutch and snapped it shut with a loud final click. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. By 10 the next morning, I would be sitting across from them on the coast with the final papers between us and federal investigators already working from the evidence we had preserved. I would look my treacherous son and his malicious family directly in the eyes. I would play the role of the defeated, broken mother one last time. And then I would systematically, ruthlessly, and legally burn their entire lives to the ground. The heavy tires of his black sport utility vehicle crunched aggressively against the pristine white gravel of the sprawling circular driveway. The humid Savannah morning air was thick with the scent of salt water and impending rain. I stepped out of the climate-controlled cabin, my tailored navy blue suit, feeling like a suit of heavy iron armor. I looked up at the massive modern beachfront estate. It was a grotesque, towering monument to unearned wealth and profound deceit, built with sharp architectural angles and imported gray stone. It was paid for entirely by the sweat I had left on the concrete floors of Atlanta commercial warehouses over the last 40 years. I kept my face completely slack. I rounded my shoulders slightly intentionally, maintaining the carefully constructed illusion of the crushed, terrified, and rapidly declining elderly woman they fully expected to see walking through their doors. I climbed the wide, floating concrete steps leading up to the massive mahogany double doors. I did not bother to knock or ring the digital doorbell. I simply pushed the heavy wood open with both hands and stepped directly into the cavernous, sunlit foyer. The interior of the house smelled strongly of expensive citrus room spray, an arrogant, unearned victory. Vivian was lounging comfortably on a sprawling, pristine white sectional sofa in the center of the sunken living room. Her bare feet were resting carelessly on the edge of a custom glass coffee table. She was holding a crystal martini glass, a single green olive resting against the delicate rim. Her face was flushed with the kind of triumphant, malicious satisfaction that only comes from successfully stealing another person's entire life. Chloe stood near the massive waterfall-edge kitchen island. She was holding a thick, glossy brochure for luxury custom yachts. She was already running her manicured index finger over the glossy pages of a 60-foot catamaran, completely ignoring my arrival. Marcus stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the crashing ocean waves. He wore a crisp, tailored charcoal suit without a tie. He looked entirely too comfortable and thoroughly relaxed in a house he had just purchased through a massive act of federal wire fraud. He turned around when he heard my low heels click against the imported Italian marble floorboards. A smug, deeply condescending smile stretched widely across his face. It was completely devoid of any residual guilt or panic from the boardroom ambush yesterday morning. He walked slowly toward me, holding a thick stack of legal documents bound inside a dark blue presentation folder. He gestured casually to the long, modern glass dining table, instructing me to take a seat. I moved with deliberate, manufactured slowness. I pulled out a rigid, highly uncomfortable acrylic dining chair and lowered myself down. Vivian did not bother to stand up to greet me. She simply raised her half-empty martini glass in a mocking theatrical salute from the sofa, taking a slow, deliberate sip. Chloe tossed the luxury yacht brochure onto the marble kitchen counter with a loud smack. She walked over to the dining area and rested her hands firmly on her husband's broad shoulders, staring down at me with absolute contempt. "You actually showed up this morning," Chloe sneered. Her voice dripped with venomous, unrelenting condescension. "I honestly thought we might have to send the armed police officers and the paramedics to your house after all. Do not worry about your future Gloria. We found a very nice, very secure, and heavily monitored assisted living facility in the northern suburbs. They have a lovely knitting club on Tuesday afternoons in the common room. You will fit right in with the other expired relics and dementia patients. You can spend your remaining days making sweaters and eating unseasoned oatmeal while Marcus finally brings Vance Logistics into the 21st century where it belongs." I ignored her completely. I did not look at her face or acknowledge her vicious insults. I kept my eyes focused downward, looking directly at the thick stack of legal documents Marcus had just placed onto the glass table in front of me. He tapped the top page of the packet with his index finger. He began explaining the specific legal terms with a sickeningly professional, deeply clinical tone. He spoke to me as if he were closing a standard commercial warehouse lease instead of actively executing a hostile corporate takeover against his own mother. He detailed the immediate relinquishment of my executive voting rights on the corporate board. He pointed out the specific clause, completely transferring my exclusive signatory power over the primary commercial holding accounts directly into his name. He proudly highlighted the final paragraph on the last page. It was a comprehensive, ironclad, legally binding liability waiver. It expressly attempted to waive future civil claims arising from the forged authority documents and the disputed transfer. He told me that the exact moment I signed my name on the bottom line, the involuntary psychiatric committal order he held in his breast pocket would be officially shredded. He promised that I would be allowed to walk out of the front door as a free, albeit completely bankrupt woman. I slowly turned my gaze away from the documents and looked directly at Vivian. I asked her what her specific legal role in this particular transaction was. She stood up from the white sectional sofa, carrying her crystal martini glass over to the dining table. She smiled a predatory, terrifying, and deeply unnatural expression. She explained proudly that she was signing the secondary paperwork as the executing collateral holder. She stated clearly that her offshore firm, Azure Investments, was officially calling in the 51% collateral pledge Marcus had signed in the boardroom yesterday. She boasted that she was legally absorbing $15 million of my liquid commercial assets to satisfy her firm's corporate interests. She spoke with total arrogance, completely unaware of her actual situation. She had absolutely no idea that she was actually executing a massive financial transfer to satisfy a lethal overdue debt to an international criminal syndicate. And she had absolutely no idea that I already knew everything about her money laundering operations. I reached deep into the pocket of my tailored navy blue suit and pulled out my heavy, solid, gold-plated fountain pen. It was the exact same pen I had used to sign the commercial property deed on my very first warehouse in the West End 40 years ago. I uncapped the pen, slowly, taking my time. I let my hand tremble just enough to perfectly sell the performance of a broken, defeated woman surrendering her kingdom. I pressed the sharp gold nib against the thick parchment paper. I signed my full formal legal name on the primary relinquishment line. My signature was absolutely flawless, matching the official banking records perfectly to ensure there would be zero administrative delays. I slid the heavy document packet across the smooth glass table directly to Marcus. He snatched the folder eagerly, his eyes scanning my fresh signature rapidly to ensure it was authentic and properly formatted. He pulled a sleek silver pen from his jacket pocket. He aggressively signed his own name on the designated line, officially declaring himself as the new sole executive director and primary financial operator of Vance Logistics. He did not even pause to read the fine print buried within the indemnification clauses. He then passed the thick folder across the table to his mother-in-law. Vivian set her martini glass down hard on the table, leaving a wet ring of condensation on the pristine glass surface. She grabbed the silver pen from Marcus and signed her name with a dramatic, sweeping, and highly arrogant flourish on the collateral execution line. By signing that specific piece of paper, she was formally legally claiming direct ownership of the highly leveraged corporate assets. The trap was now completely set. The bait was fully taken. The corporate poison pill I had buried in the company bylaws a decade ago had officially been swallowed. I sat perfectly still, watching the dark black ink dry against the thick white paper. I remained in my chair for exactly 10 seconds, letting the profound, devastating gravity of the moment settle heavily into the humid air of the room. Marcus let out a massive, shuddering breath of profound relief, running a hand through his hair, as he realized he had just acquired a multi-million-dollar empire. Chloe clapped her hands together, a sharp, joyous, and grating sound. She turned to Vivian and asked if they should call the luxury yacht broker right now to secure their deposit on the catamaran before the afternoon rush. I closed the cap on my gold fountain pen with a loud, authoritative, and sharp metallic click. I stopped slouching in the acrylic chair. I straightened my spine, forcefully rolling my shoulders back until my posture was perfectly rigid and commanding. The fragile, broken, and terrified elderly mother vanished completely from my face, replaced by the ruthless commercial real estate mogul who had crushed dozens of predatory competitors. My expression turned to absolute unforgiving and terrifying stone. I placed both of my hands flat against the glass dining table and stood up slowly, towering over the signed documents. I looked Marcus dead in the eye. I did not speak a single word of anger or resentment. I simply raised my left wrist and looked down at the face of my gold watch. 5, I counted aloud. My voice dropped an entire octave, losing all its previous fragility, echoing loudly and firmly off the high vaulted ceilings of the luxury mansion. Marcus frowned deeply. His smug, victorious smile faltered slightly, replaced by a sudden flicker of genuine confusion. "Mom, what in the world are you talking about?" he asked, reaching out to pull the signed legal documents closer to his chest. 4. I continued my gaze, shifting away from him and locking directly onto Vivian. Her hand was resting casually near her half-empty martini glass, but her fingers twitched nervously at the sudden change in my vocal tone. 3, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step away from the dining table. Chloe took a sudden step backward, crossing her arms defensively across her chest, looking around the bright living room as if expecting something to fall from the ceiling. 2, I stated clearly. I looked back at my son, letting him fully see the sheer terrifying clarity and absolute sanity burning violently in my eyes. The realization that he had walked into a trap began to dawn on his pale features. 1. The exact second the final number left my lips, the mansion went dark. The air conditioning stopped, the smart screens died, and the motorized blinds froze halfway down the ocean-facing windows. It was not one of Jamal's tricks. Under the federal search plan arranged that morning, the utility feed to the property had been temporarily isolated, so agents could enter without the smart home system locking doors, wiping connected devices, or alerting anyone outside. A moment later, the electronic deadbolts dropped into manual mode with a series of heavy metallic clicks. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Marcus stumbled backward and struck his knee against the glass dining table. I remained standing at the head of the table, calm, because I knew exactly what the darkness meant. The warrant team was in position. The darkness stretched across the living room for several long seconds. Marcus demanded to know what was happening, his voice suddenly stripped of its executive polish. Chloe fumbled for her phone. Vivian threatened to call the police and have me arrested for trespassing and property damage. I told her to do exactly that. "Invite law enforcement in," I said. "Invite every investigator you can reach." Marcus ordered me to stop speaking in riddles, but the performance was over. I pointed to the signed documents on the table and told him that the frightened mother he had seen in the boardroom was the role he needed me to play. I had given him a clean opportunity to walk away, tell the truth, and cooperate. Instead, he had insisted on an irrevocable transfer, a liability waiver, and Vivian's execution of the collateral claim. Their signatures were now evidence, not victory trophies. I explained that the power interruption was part of a lawful evidence preservation plan, not sabotage. The property was already the subject of a federal search warrant based on the records Jamal and the forensic accountants had preserved, along with bank confirmations and corporate server logs. The agents outside were there because investigators had independently verified the offshore routing pattern and the forged documents. I did not give them another lecture about the charter. I simply told Marcus to turn to the cross-referenced page and read his own initials. He did. His breathing changed before he reached the bottom. Vivian leaned over his shoulder and demanded a loophole, but Marcus kept staring at the paper. The documents were doing the work now. There was nothing left for me to repeat. That silence hurt him more than another threat would have. He had built his entire plan on the assumption that I was confused, sentimental, and too frightened to understand paperwork. Now the paper itself was contradicting him. Chloe moved around the table and tried to take the folder, but Vivian snatched it first. Her eyes raced over the pages. She began asking Marcus whether his attorneys had reviewed this version, whether the corporate charter could supersede his new appointment, whether my signature could be challenged. Each question came faster than the one before it. Marcus finally snapped at her to be quiet. It was the first crack in the alliance I had watched them celebrate at the Onyx. I did not enjoy seeing my son panic. What I felt was colder than pleasure. I felt the final confirmation that he had been given chance after chance to stop. He could have confessed when I confronted him at dinner. He could have withdrawn the forged incapacity claim. He could have told the board the truth. He could have read the papers in Savannah. At every turn he had chosen control over honesty. There was nothing left for me to rescue except the company and myself. The Protective Trust had already locked the affected corporate assets pending judicial review, and the company remained intact. What Marcus and Vivian had acquired was personal exposure, the unauthorized debt, the representations they had made to induce the transaction, and the restitution obligations that would follow if prosecutors proved the laundering and wire fraud scheme. Marcus stammered that his lawyers could void the documents. I reminded him that no private waiver could erase criminal liability, and no contract could convert forged authority into legitimate authority. His own insistence on an irrevocable civil waiver merely made his state of mind easier to prove. Chloe shouted that none of it mattered because her mother had enough offshore wealth to fight for years. I looked at Vivian and said only one thing: Azure Investments was not a private fortune. Federal investigators had the source records. That was enough. I did not recite the routing history again. Marcus had seen the ledgers in the packet counsel prepared, and Vivian knew exactly what those records meant. Marcus turned toward her slowly. The fear on his face changed shape. Until that moment, he had still been treating me as the enemy and Vivian as the person who had saved him. Now he asked her where the original money had come from. She told him not to be ridiculous. He asked again. She reached for her martini instead of answering. Marcus slapped the glass away from her hand, sending it skidding across the table without breaking. Chloe screamed at him, but he barely seemed to hear her. He demanded to know whether the threats she had described were really about gambling losses. Vivian's mouth tightened. That tiny hesitation told him more than any accusation I could have made. He stepped backward, staring at the woman whose approval he had valued enough to betray his own mother. He asked whether she had used Vance Logistics to move criminal money. Vivian finally told him that he had known there were risks and that he had enjoyed every benefit when the money was flowing. Marcus answered that she had never told him what kind of money it was. She laughed once and said he had never cared enough to ask. That sentence broke something in him. He looked at Chloe, perhaps expecting his wife to deny it, but she was staring at her mother with the same horrified confusion. For the first time, the three people who had presented themselves as a united family at the restaurant were no longer standing together. Their alliance had been built on greed, and greed had given each of them a different version of the truth. Marcus had believed he was stealing to escape a financial disaster. Chloe had believed her husband was finally taking an inheritance she thought he deserved. Vivian had known she was trying to push criminal exposure into a company clean enough to hide it. I stayed out of their argument. I had spent the previous day being forced to defend my sanity to strangers. I would not spend this morning refereeing the collapse of people who had created their own crisis. I simply moved the signed packet out of reach and placed my hand over it. The originals would go to investigators. No one in that room was going to tear a page, spill a drink across the signature, or make one more record disappear. Marcus noticed the gesture and looked toward the front windows. His voice fell to a whisper when he asked me who was outside. Before I answered, a low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the marble floor. Vivian stopped speaking. Chloe turned toward the ocean-facing glass. The sound grew heavier, closer, until the expensive framed artwork on the wall began to tremble. Before Vivian could finally utter a single word to justify her catastrophic life-destroying manipulation, a low, intense, and deeply rhythmic thumping sound began to vibrate through the solid concrete floorboards of the sprawling mansion. The heavy sound rapidly intensified, vibrating the very air inside the darkroom. The thumping grew into a deafening mechanical roar that violently shook the expensive imported artwork hanging on the pristine white walls. The unmistakable heavy chopping of military-grade helicopter rotor blades descended directly over the flat roof of the luxury coastal estate. Bright, blinding beams of intense white searchlights cut violently through the narrow gaps in the jammed window blinds, illuminating the thick dust particles dancing erratically in the humid air. The piercing, high-pitched wail of multiple synchronized police sirens echoed loudly down the dark coastal highway, rapidly approaching the heavy iron front gates of the massive property. The heavy screeching of heavy-duty tactical tires tearing aggressively across the white gravel driveway surrounded the entire perimeter of the house. Chloe began screaming hysterically, dropping to her knees and covering her ears as the deafening, overwhelming noise completely consumed the room. Marcus fell heavily against the granite waterfall kitchen island, his legs completely giving out beneath his tailored suit. He stared at the shattered front doors with wide, utterly terrified eyes. I stood perfectly still in the exact center of the escalating chaos, my posture completely unyielding, calmly, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. A booming, electronically amplified voice echoed aggressively from a high-powered tactical megaphone positioned just outside the property. The stern, commanding voice ordered every single individual inside the residence to step away from the doors, keep their hands entirely visible, and surrender immediately. Vivian dropped her crystal martini glass. It shattered violently against the Italian marble floor, sending sharp, glittering shards of broken crystal flying rapidly across the room. A tremendous explosive crash completely obliterated the heavy mahogany front doors. The heavy steel head of a law enforcement tactical battering ram smashed brutally through the reinforced wood, splintering the massive doors inward, directly off their expensive metal hinges. A sudden, overwhelming flood of blinding tactical flashlights swept violently into the dark, expansive foyer. 24 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and heavy protective body armor swarmed rapidly into the sunken living room. The bright, highly visible yellow letters FBI were emblazoned aggressively across their heavy ballistic vests. They carried compact, highly advanced assault rifles raised tightly to their shoulders, their bright red laser sights sweeping rapidly across the trembling chests of my son, my daughter-in-law, and her mother. The lead federal agent barked aggressive, deafening commands ordering everyone to hit the ground immediately. The sheer, overwhelming display of federal force completely neutralized any fleeting thought of resistance. Jamal walked calmly through the shattered front entrance, flanked directly by the lead financial crimes investigator from the Atlanta field office. My grandson held his encrypted laptop securely under his arm. He raised his free hand and pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at Vivian and Marcus. The federal agents moved with brutal, terrifying, and highly practiced efficiency. 2 agents lunged forward and tackled Vivian aggressively to the hard marble floor. She shrieked wildly, kicking her bare feet and demanding loudly to speak to her corporate lawyers as they forced her arms roughly behind her back. The heavy metal handcuffs clicked tightly around her wrists, securing her completely. Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream of sheer, unadulterated panic. She turned abruptly and sprinted desperately toward the rear patio doors, attempting frantically to flee toward the dark beach. She slammed her shoulder heavily against the thick security glass, completely forgetting that the electronic deadbolts were permanently engaged by the power outage. She bounced forcefully off the reinforced window pane and collapsed awkwardly onto the marble floor. 3 federal agents swarmed her instantly, pinning her shoulders aggressively to the ground and locking her wrists tightly in cold steel cuffs. She sobbed uncontrollably, her expensive designer dress tearing against the sharp shards of the broken martini glass. Marcus did not attempt to run. He did not fight the federal agents as they grabbed his arms and slammed him roughly against the granite kitchen island. His eyes were wide, completely vacant, and utterly consumed by the devastating reality of his total destruction. The lead investigator read the formal charges aloud over the chaotic, overlapping shouting in the room. He announced the immediate, unbailable warrants for federal racketeering, international money laundering, high-level corporate conspiracy, and massive wire fraud. Marcus realized instantly that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was not there for a petty family financial dispute. They were there to utterly dismantle a violent cartel money laundering syndicate, and he had just legally signed his own name to the primary collateral documents, connecting him directly to the criminal enterprise. Marcus sank slowly to his knees as the agent secured his handcuffs. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his flushed, sweaty face. He begged me for absolute mercy. He pleaded with me to use my corporate lawyers to save him, crying out that he was my only son. I looked down at him, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored navy blue suit with meticulous, deliberate care. I stared into his terrified eyes with absolute, unyielding coldness. "I brought you into this world, Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the raid with lethal, icy precision. "But today I am taking you out of my business." The flashing red and blue tactical lights of the federal police cruisers faded into the humid Savannah night as the armored transport vehicles disappeared down the dark coastal highway. I stood in the center of the shattered grand foyer of the massive beachfront mansion, surrounded entirely by federal agents methodically cataloging the devastating evidence of my son's catastrophic greed. The lead financial investigator handed me a crisp white business card and assured me my corporate assets remained completely untouched behind the protective trust and bank freeze already in place. Jamal and I walked out of that cold, hollow house, climbed into the back of our waiting sport utility vehicle, and returned to Atlanta to let the legal process deal with what they had done. The ensuing legal process was public, methodical, and far slower than the raid had been. Within days, after obtaining the necessary court orders, federal investigators froze accounts and assets tied to Marcus, Chloe, and Vivian, while the financial investigation expanded. The local news stations broadcasted the dramatic raid on live television. News helicopters circled the Savannah area property after agents executed the search warrant, while investigative reporters detailed the staggering, horrifying scope of the South American cartel money laundering syndicate. The outside financial firms and lenders that had worked with Marcus moved quickly to distance themselves once the federal allegations became public. They permanently severed his corporate ties, stripped his executive credentials, and initiated proceedings to revoke his professional registrations and industry credentials. He was detained pending an initial hearing, and the image of the polished executive in a tailored suit was replaced on every local broadcast by the booking photograph of a man facing a long list of federal allegations. Vivian Carmichael found absolutely no salvation in her hidden offshore accounts. The federal prosecutors systematically dismantled her entire fraudulent empire brick by brick. Brilliant forensic accountants formally seized her luxury properties in Cyprus, liquidated her sprawling network of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and traced every single illicit drug dollar directly back to the violent criminal syndicate. As the scope of the investigation widened, prosecutors treated her as a serious flight and safety risk. Her lawyers eventually entered plea negotiations after the offshore records and cooperating evidence left little room for the glamorous story she had told Marcus about harmless private investment money. The federal case did not end in 3 dramatic weeks the way television trials do. It took months of grand jury work, forensic accounting motions, plea negotiations, and evidentiary hearings before the final sentences were imposed. I attended the major proceedings and watched the story Marcus had tried to manufacture about my incompetence collapse under records, timestamps, bank confirmations, witness testimony, and his own signatures. Vivian ultimately entered a guilty plea after prosecutors confronted her with the offshore ledgers and cooperating witnesses. At sentencing, the judge described the laundering operation as deliberate, sophisticated, and destructive. He imposed a 20-year federal sentence together with sweeping forfeiture and restitution orders. Her luxury properties, jewelry vehicles, and the Savannah area estate were seized or sold under court supervision to satisfy those orders. Marcus stood before the exact same judge 2 days later. He looked utterly, profoundly broken. His dark hair had thinned dramatically from the intense stress, his posture was heavily hunched, and the arrogant sociopathic smirk that used to define his face was permanently erased. His overworked public defender tried desperately to argue that Marcus was heavily manipulated by his malicious mother-in-law. The lawyer claimed that my son was simply a desperate, terrified man trying to protect his family from violent cartel threats. The lead prosecutor immediately countered that ridiculous narrative by displaying the raw internet protocol logs Jamal had expertly extracted from our corporate server room. The digital metadata proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my son had premeditated the forgery of my medical directive months before the cartel debt became critical. He had planned to steal my commercial real estate company from the very beginning. The judge sentenced Marcus to 15 hard years in federal prison for corporate conspiracy, massive wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. The judge specifically noted on the official record that using his legal credentials to fabricate an involuntary psychiatric hold against his own mother demonstrated a chilling, irredeemable level of human malice. As the armed bailiffs escorted him out of the courtroom, Marcus turned his head and looked at me one final time. He silently mouthed the word sorry. I simply turned my back, adjusted my leather clutch, and walked out the heavy oak doors, stepping into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight. Chloe was not convicted on the core money laundering counts because investigators could not prove that she understood the cartel source of the funds or the technical mechanics of the offshore transfers. Her role in humiliating me and supporting Marcus's takeover was ugly, but ugliness is not the same thing as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. She still faced civil claims asset forfeiture consequences and the collapse of the lifestyle she had built around money that was never truly hers. The sweeping financial consequences decimated her privileged existence. Because the sprawling Buckhead estate was still legally registered directly to my commercial holding company, I officially evicted her. I gave her exactly 48 hours to pack her personal clothing into cheap black trash bags before I dispatched a team of contractors to change the exterior locks. I immediately placed the luxury property on the commercial real estate market and sold it to a foreign investor. The bank aggressively seized her 2 luxury vehicles to satisfy the outstanding secondary mortgages Marcus had secretly acquired without her knowledge. Her wealthy country club friends immediately blacklisted her, refusing to answer her desperate phone calls or offer her a temporary place to sleep. She was forced to file for complete, devastating personal bankruptcy. Today, the arrogant woman who once spent her afternoons browsing glossy brochures for 60-foot luxury catamarans works the grueling overnight shift at a 24-hour fast food diner on the dangerous outskirts of the city. She spends her dark nights scrubbing thick industrial grease off the kitchen floor tiles, earning minimum wage to pay for a tiny roach-infested studio apartment. She is currently living the exact same grueling, impoverished life I survived 40 years ago, but she lacks the strength, the grit, and the fundamental character to ever build her way out of the gutter. With the greedy parasites permanently removed from my life, I returned my absolute unbroken focus to Vance Logistics. I walked into the 40th floor executive suite on a crisp Monday morning and reclaimed my rightful seat at the head of the long glass boardroom table. The original founding partners greeted me with profound, unspoken respect. They openly acknowledged that my strategic ruthlessness had single-handedly saved our company and its $15 million in liquid operating assets from total annihilation. The commercial business thrived exponentially under my renewed leadership. I aggressively expanded our logistics routes across the eastern seaboard, acquiring 3 massive new commercial distribution centers in less than a single calendar year. But I did not undertake this massive corporate expansion alone. I officially promoted my grandson Jamal to the highest executive suite in the building. He graduated at the absolute top of his university class, armed with a prestigious degree in forensic accounting and a brilliant razor-sharp mind for advanced cybersecurity. I gave him the sprawling corner office that once belonged to his treacherous father. Jamal completely redesigned our entire corporate security infrastructure from the ground up. He implemented advanced biometric safeguards and impenetrable federal firewalls that ensured absolutely no external threat could ever compromise our operating capital again. I personally mentored him every single day. I taught him the ruthless art of commercial contract negotiation. I taught him how to read the hidden weaknesses in rival executives during high-stakes acquisitions. I showed him the heavy, solitary burden of true executive leadership, and I ingrained in him the critical, non-negotiable importance of absolute loyalty. On his 22nd birthday, I formally drafted a completely new ironclad estate plan with my trusted corporate attorneys. I transferred the entirety of my commercial properties, the various holding companies, and my vast liquid assets into an impenetrable generational trust. I officially named Jamal as the sole beneficiary and the absolute legal executor of my entire estate. The powerful matriarchy I had built from dirt, sweat, and tears was finally secure. It was resting safely in the capable hands of a young man who truly understood the profound value of hard work and unyielding integrity. He had proven his loyalty under the most extreme, terrifying pressure imaginable, and he had rightfully earned every single piece of the empire he now helped me govern. In the months after the case ended, I also changed the way I ran the company. I had spent years assuming that family loyalty could substitute for institutional safeguards, and Marcus had taught me how dangerous that assumption was. We separated family relationships from financial authority, required two-person approval for major transfers, expanded independent board review, and created a formal process for challenging any future claim that an executive had become medically incapacitated. Jamal helped design the technical controls, but I insisted that the human controls mattered just as much. No single person, not even the founder's child, would ever again be able to manufacture a crisis and quietly turn it into ownership. That reform did not make the betrayal hurt less. It made the pain useful. I could not undo the fact that my son had tried to erase me, but I could make certain the company learned from the attack instead of merely surviving it. The crisp autumn leaves were turning a brilliant shade of gold outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my executive office. I stood behind my massive oak desk, holding a warm ceramic cup of hot black coffee. I watched the bustling, vibrant city of Atlanta stretch out for miles below my vantage point. The heavy traffic moved in steady, rhythmic rivers of red and white light along the sprawling highways. Massive yellow construction cranes built new, towering glass skyscrapers against the fading orange horizon. I had helped build this beautiful skyline. I had carved my name permanently into the deep concrete foundations of this city. And I had successfully defended my kingdom against the most intimate, devastating siege possible. The corporate building was completely quiet, the evening administrative staff having already gone home for the night. I walked slowly across the plush carpet, my reflection catching clearly in the dark window glass. I did not see an old, oblivious fossil staring back at me. I saw a seasoned warrior. I saw a brilliant survivor. I saw a woman who had walked through hellfire twice and emerged completely unburned. Society places a heavy, suffocating, and deeply unfair burden on mothers. We are told from the exact moment we hold our newborn children that our capacity for forgiveness must be infinite. We are constantly expected to endure profound disrespect, to absorb malicious betrayal, and to sacrifice our own sanity on the altar of unconditional maternal love. We are taught by the world to quietly absorb the toxic venom of our offspring and smile gracefully through the agonizing pain. But unconditional love should never equate to unconditional surrender. A true mother provides essential shelter-firm guidance and boundless opportunity. I gave my son every possible advantage in this brutal world. I handed him an expensive Ivy League education, a highly prestigious corporate title, and a comfortable life entirely devoid of the grueling poverty I had endured in my youth. He deliberately chose to take those beautiful gifts and forge them into a lethal weapon. He chose to look at the woman who gave him life and see only a temporary obstacle blocking his path to unearned wealth. He made a calculated, cold-blooded, and entirely conscious decision to destroy me. When a person attempts to strip away your basic human rights, to lock you inside a secure psychiatric ward, and to violently steal the legacy you bled to build their biological connection to you, becomes completely and utterly irrelevant. A parasite is simply a parasite, regardless of whether it shares your genetic code. Some wealthy people in my social circle whispered about me after the dramatic arrests. They gossiped quietly at their exclusive country club luncheons, clutching their pearl necklaces in feigned, hypocritical shock. They said I was far too harsh. They said I was entirely too ruthless for letting my own flesh and blood be dragged away in heavy metal handcuffs in front of half of the Atlanta corporate elite. They argued passionately that a mother should always forgive her child's mistakes, no matter how severe the transgression might be. I completely and categorically reject their weak, cowardly philosophy. I do not call a calculated attempt to seize another person's accounts and legal identity a simple mistake. I do not call bribing a corrupt judge to declare me legally incompetent a minor lapse in judgment. I call it an absolute unforgivable declaration of war. When someone declares war on your life, you do not sit down at a table and attempt to negotiate a peaceful surrender. You do not hand them the heavy iron keys to your castle and blindly hope they show you mercy. You utilize every single weapon in your vast arsenal to crush their advance completely. You salt the earth beneath their feet to ensure they can never rise against you again. I protected the legacy of Vance Logistics. I protected the financial future of my loyal grandson. Most importantly, I protected my own fundamental right to exist with absolute, unyielding dignity. I took a slow sip of my dark coffee, letting the bitter, grounding taste wash over my tongue. I turned away from the sprawling, glowing city skyline and looked directly forward into the quiet silence of the room. Some people called me ruthless. They said a mother should protect her son no matter what. But a true matriarch protects her legacy from parasites even if she gave birth to one. If your own blood tried to bury you alive, would you have handed them the shovel, or would you have built a prison with it? Let me know in the comments.